Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and this is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be doing a special breakdown of Russia's nuclear weapons. That's right, it's been in the news a lot, but we need to ask ourselves how much is hype and kind of fear-mongering, and how much of the fears of nuclear conflict are legitimate. So let's get into it. Okay, so first and foremost, I think the thing that we really need to know is the difference between strategic and tactical nuclear weapons. Now, if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that according to U.S. military doctrine, there are three sort of levels we can think of military operations. The top is the strategic. This is, geopolitics, right? Whether or not to engage in a war. Why? What are your objectives in a war? How do we win this war? Big picture questions. Operational is the middle level, and of course that is things like what objectives do we need to achieve to reach our end state to win our war. And then finally is the tactical, right? How do we maneuver? How do we position our forces? How do we engage the enemy in a way that's going to get us a win? Now, when we talk about nuclear weapons, to no one's surprise, the terminology was coined by the Air Force and some big nerds at RAND in the 1950s, one of the earliest think tanks. And they used strategic and tactical as the two terms to describe nuclear weapons. Now, if you were to impose that over the conventional terminology, there are no tactical nuclear weapons. Inherently, creating a nuclear explosion is just so big that it can only be used really in the service of an operational objective, right? A squad or platoon is not going to be able to, throw a nuclear grenade at their enemies or launch a mortar with a nuclear weapon. It's just not possible. The physics of nuclear fission and fusion don't allow that to occur. Guys, I wanted to thank today's sponsor, adamandeve.com. Use code COMBAT to get 50% off one item and free shipping anywhere in the US and Canada. They offer 24/7 customer service, 90-day no-hassle returns, discreet packaging, and 20% of their profits go to combating HIV around the globe. Link is in the description, and thanks again to adamandeve.com for sponsoring today's video. So they're only operational weapons. Well, but when we say tactical nukes, we mean operational nukes. What is a strategic nuclear weapon? Well, you can see here is kind of a breakdown of the different types, right? They say the Federation of American Scientists calls them strategic and non-strategic. Strategic nuclear weapons refer to nuclear weapons which are capable of reaching all the way into another continent, right? These are oftentimes to target large areas. These are nuclear warheads with the explosive capability of destroying an entire military base, an entire hardened military facility, and a large portion of a major city. In contrast, tactical nuclear weapons, or non-strategic as the FAST calls them, are nuclear weapons whose yield is lower, who could destroy still a fairly large area, several city blocks, a large military formation, but are generally shorter in range and not a threat to other countries, especially on other continents. So that's a good way to think about tactical nuclear weapons are ones that could be used in a conflict sort of near conventional forces, right? And strategic nuclear weapons are those that you could classically think of the ones that Russia lobbing them all the way to the U.S. and the U.S. lobbing them all the way to Russia. Those are your strategic weapons. What is the fear exactly that people have around nuclear and strategic weapons, tactical and strategic nuclear weapons? Well, the fear right now is that Putin will choose to stave off an inevitable defeat in Ukraine by using nuclear weapons against Kiev or against the Ukrainian military or civilian population. What are these fears sort of based on? Well, to understand the source of these fears, you've got to understand a couple of things. First, we don't actually know, despite this, informative looking infographic, we don't really know how many nuclear weapons the major powers have. You can see Russia has around, publicly, our best guesstimate is around 1,500 strategic deployed nuclear weapons. These are weapons that can reach across the ocean and are ready to go at a moment's notice. Then you have reserve or non-deployed. These are sort of the backups that can be brought into service fairly quickly if the need arises. But again, it's not clear on whether these are strategic or tactical. Again, they've got to get pulled out of the mothball, and we don't really know what these are. So these are kind of an unknown reserve. And then you have retired. These are nuclear weapons that are semi-dismantled, right, but could be, with a couple of months, returned to operational service. Right, you can see there's also the deployed non-strategic category for the United States. We have around 100 of these tactical nuclear weapons that we publicly acknowledge are out there. These are to defend countries within our nuclear umbrella. A good example would be someone like South Korea, who is protected by the U.S. nuclear umbrella, but their biggest threat, their neighbor to the north, is probably not going to launch a strategic weapon. It's sort of preposterous. They don't actually even have, it's not clear that they have the technological capability to roll out a strategic weapon. So to respond to these, and also a strategic weapon would be so devastating on the Korean Peninsula that it would actually, like, if North Korea's goal is to reunify the countries, nuking the country that you're trying to unify with is vastly overkill. And so in order to counter that, the US has said, hey, we're going to have these non-strategic lower yield weapons, but we're going to publicly let you know that they're here so that Kim Jong-un knows, hey, if you mess with our friends the South Koreans, we have an answer, we can answer in kind. But Russia, you would be crazy to think Russia does not have tactical nuclear weapons. They have been very, very cagey for really since they developed nuclear weapons in the 40s about exactly what they have and exactly how big they are. Now, strategic nuclear weapons are governed by something called the START Treaty. Let's see if we can find it here. START treaties are just an arms control treaty in which both sides have agreed that there's a certain level of a certain number of nuclear warheads, of strategic nuclear warheads, that both sides are going to agree that they will not exceed. So you've got, let's see if we can find a link to it here about state deterrence weapons. Maybe they've got it up here, but it's called the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and it simply governs, it caps the number of, well, strategic weapons. That's why you can see that, right, the United States and Russia have just about the same number of total inventory, but obviously if the United States so chose, it could build lots, and I mean a lot more. And it did. At the peak of the Cold War, both sides had probably about 3 or 4 times as many nuclear weapons, around 20,000. And so they've agreed that 20,000 is way overkill, and as long as they both have enough to ensure something called mutually assured destruction, then they really don't need to build more than that. Mutually assured destruction, of course, is this idea that when you have 2 nuclear armed states, the potential of them to destroy each other is so great that it becomes not worth it to use your nuclear weapons on the other country. And so Russia knows if it was to launch its weapons at the United States, that the United States would just launch their own weapons and they would destroy each other, and ensuring that whatever objective they hope to achieve won't be achieved. But this is important because mutually assured destruction is predicated on a really important idea, and that's the idea that both sides have credible nuclear weapon threats. And this is also why, so there's a couple of problems that are pretty obvious. As we're seeing, Russia does not have a mutually assured destruction relationship with Ukraine. And in fact, doesn't have a mutually assured destruction with almost any country that doesn't have nuclear weapons, right? The list here is the only countries in the world that have nuclear weapons, meaning that they can only do a mutually assured destruction technically with these 5 or 8 countries. So what then do countries like Germany, Japan, South Korea, Estonia, right? How do these countries live in a world where there's these big dogs with tons of nuclear weapons? The answer is through mutual defense treaties, or what's sometimes called the nuclear umbrella. These are agreements that countries will sign, usually they're part of NATO countries, where a big country like the United States comes in and says, hey, if you promise to contribute your military to NATO and to NATO standards, we will guarantee that an attack on your country will be treated like a nuclear attack on our own. And so by treaty, the U.S. would treat a nuclear strike on Berlin just like it would treat a nuclear strike on New York, meaning it would throw its nuclear weapons at the attacker. So this is how the mutually assured destruction sort of expands over time. Right now, Russia ran the same thing with many of the Soviet republics and later other countries in the Iron Curtain, in which they extended over their nuclear umbrella over their allies and supporters. The problem that we run into is that Ukraine is not part of these countries. This is Ukraine's ability or inability to join NATO is the entire source of this, one of the origins of this conflict. There's more going on about Putin's vision of a greater Russia, et cetera. But at least according to Putin, it's Ukraine's lack of NATO membership that drove him to invade the country in the first place. So Ukraine doesn't have a big brother who's going to provide them that nuclear shield. And this means that Putin and Russia are not subject to mutually assured destruction if they choose to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So that is why people are starting to worry about it. Now, what are the uses of tactical nuclear weapons, right? That's all Russia would need to use. A strategic nuclear weapon would be almost certainly overkill for a bunch of reasons. And in fact, I'm going to argue that a tactical nuclear weapon is also basically overkill for the same reasons. Let's talk about what those are for a second. So why might Putin choose to use nuclear weapons, or why might people worry that this is an option? Well, first, Putin probably would use nuclear weapons based on Soviet doctrine to either achieve some battlefield effects, right? Destroy an armored column or a base or something, or to force Kiev to the negotiating table, usually by destroying something very, very important to, again, say downtown Kiev or the whole city of Lviv. And that what would force the Ukrainians, when they realize they really aren't able to fight Russia anymore, that they'll sit down at the negotiating table and give them basically whatever they want. This is kind of the protocol that the U.S. used in the Second World War against Japan. They dropped 2 nuclear weapons on 2 major military-industrial cities, but still civilian cities. And then immediately after, the shock value was so great that Japan came to the negotiating table and basically surrendered. And even that, there was a contingent in Japan that thought they should continue to fight. So it certainly wasn't as clean cut as I'm retelling it. But the other use that they may do of tactical nuclear weapons is to prevent a conventional defeat. If they're facing a total defeat on the battlefield, they may simply try to use nuclear weapons to blunt their enemy's efforts to advance and take territory and defeat the Russian army on the battlefield. So those are kind of the 2 potential uses of these nuclear weapons. Now, what are the issues with them? And there's actually a lot of issues with just using a tactical nuclear weapon to get what you want. The first is that you have to remember that Russia has technically, according to itself, annexed almost all of the contested regions. That would mean that if he were to use a nuclear weapon on the battlefield, he would use it on technically Russian territory. And in a lot of ways, he would kill a lot of people who are technically Russian citizens. This is what's known as a bad look. And it's a complete topsy-turvy inversion of Russian military doctrine. Doesn't mean that it is unheard of, but remember, Russia and Putin, as we've talked about in other videos, he's orienting a lot of his military strategy, I argue way too much of his military strategy, around appeasing ultra-nationalists. And if you want to make ultra-nationalists really mad, drop a nuclear weapon on Russian territory. So that's the first problem. Then, of course, you have a larger problem of radiation, right? You use a nuclear weapon and you irradiate a large portion of the area that you've seized. Now, this is problematic because Putin and Russia aspire to actually control this territory, right? Their grandest ambitions seem to be replacing the government in Ukraine with a puppet state. Well, if you irradiate Kiev, you won't be able to replace the government with a puppet state because you've taken your capital city and turned it into a wasteland. Similarly, on the battlefield, right? You are taking territory that presumably has military and tactical significance, and you've irradiated it, meaning that it's really going to be very hard for your forces to pass through that area. And so you've instead blocked it off, turned it into a big obstacle instead of being able to use it as a battlefield asset. Not only that, but nuclear weapons of any size are going to produce a cloud of radiation or radioactive ash and particulate. And that can get carried by the winds into, well, whatever direction the winds are blowing. And in Ukraine, those winds blow back into Russia. So unless they were incredibly deliberate with how they used that nuclear weapon, there's at least a medium chance it's going to blow right into the faces of their own advancing troops, not to even say, again, that they're going to end up irradiating a bunch of Russian civilians. So there's even more problems, right, on top of this. Remember, the Russian infantry are not well equipped. They weren't that well equipped at the start of this war, and they definitely are not well equipped now that they've experienced such a high rate of attrition. We've seen some frighteningly unequipped Russian conscripts. Many of them don't have weapons. Many of them don't have armor, helmets, certainly not radios, but to operate in an MBC environment, a nuclear, biological, chemical environment, particularly a nuclear environment, you have to have specialized gear, functioning gas masks, the ability to change out your filters every 24 hours, a heavy-duty suit that's going to keep out or at least partially block radioactive particulate materials. You also need to solve a bunch of other really tough problems, like how do you keep your water sources from getting irradiated? How do you keep your food from being exposed to radiation over time? How do you clean vehicles so that when they leave a radioactive area, they remain operational and functional and can be crewed by new crews, right? Do you shield your cabs from radiation when soldiers drive through? These are really tough problems and really hard logistical problems, even for the U.S. military to solve, that can throw a lot of money at them. So the chances that Russian infantry are going to be able to seize territory after a nuclear strike is really limited. And it's also not clear that their infantry can even do conventional attacks. They just don't seem that well equipped. And even if you were to heavily damage the Ukrainian military in an area, it's still not totally clear that you would destroy them at a level that would really allow Russian forces to advance. It's just not clear Russia has the proverbial or even literal gas to advance through large chunks of territory at this point, even if you were to seriously cripple Ukrainian resistance. And of course, the final point is that Russia will be subject to grievous international sanctions, right? China, India, some of the only remaining buyers of Russian oil, they are still sort of walking the line, respecting many of the sanctions against Russia, but can't resist the allure of cheap oil for their economies. But if Russia was to do something to make it clear that they really can't be supported, then you would see China and India and other buyers of Russian oil probably close the door on that last ability of Russia to earn any money. When we say they'd become an international pariah, that's almost certain. Because remember, India, China, they have nuclear weapons, but look at the numbers, right? Their total inventory is very, very, very low, right? It's less than 10% of Russia and the United States. So do they really want to live in an international system where anyone with enough weapons can nuke you? No, they don't want that, because they would become losers in the international system, right? China's a first-rate power right now, and if suddenly nuclear weapons were to become a really important factor in military might, they would look like total dweebs. So all of those things, I think, are considerations. I never say never, right? Obviously, I told you Ukraine was never going to last against Russian military might, and I was wrong about that, so I could definitely be wrong about this. But these are all things that Putin is definitely aware of. Probably aware of, but his military certainly is, and they are going to at least weigh these factors when considering options if they decide to take the proverbial and literal nuclear option. Anyway, guys, thanks so much as always. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments if you like this kind of deeper dive into a relevant topic for a daily update. I can certainly do more of them if you're interested. And of course, if you want the combat video breakdowns that are just too spicy for YouTube, that I cannot put because they're just too intense, become a member of the Patreon. It's a great way to support the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.